Okay, boys and girls, are we ready for Chapter 10? Chapter 10, let me see if I can get there we go. A glum visitation. Remember, they were on their way to the visitation for Mrs. Eversham to visit Rose and Miss Marianne and to pay their condolences. "Dear Aggie," said Miss Marianne, "I deeply regret that you were exposed to the vision of poor Irma's death." She squeezed my hand, which was damp inside its clean white glove. To Granny she said, "Mrs. Morton, I apologize from the bottom of my heart. A shocking thing for a child." "We are here to give you comfort, my dear," said Granny Jane, "not the other way around. Agatha is quite a practical girl and not unduly fussed." Miss Marianne endeavored to smile, but weakly. "The police have been here again." She touched her hair and let her eyes drop shut for 2 long seconds. "What more can they expect me to say? She died a hideous death. I'm the one who brewed the tea. But how can they imagine that—" "She brewed the tea." That answered Hector's question. And she'd said so plainly with no hint of hidden guilt. This renewed my confidence momentarily. "We saw the police driving away," I said. "They came yesterday to Groveland and asked me questions, too." "What could they want from you? What did you tell them?" My idle wondering that she might have offered poison in a sugar bowl became preposterous under her imploring gaze. And yet, as Granny had suggested, who other than she and Rose would achieve wealth and peace with one simple stir of a spoon? It seemed that every minute following such a crime held a new suspicion, a new question, a new puzzle. Granny Jane put a hand on Miss Marianne's arm, smoothing the black silk with gentle strokes. "They were merely doing their duty, interviewing a witness. Do not fret, my dear." She glanced at the door where more visitors were coming in. "You'll want to speak to the others now. But keep us in mind. We live right next door should you need us." For someone who had suggested only moments earlier that this woman had conspired to murder, Granny was being exceedingly tender. These were the manners, I supposed, that she expected me to learn. How to be gracious at all times, even with villains. Miss Marianne, shivering in agitation, leaned close and whispered, "Have you written a poem about this? Do you have your little book with you?" I shook my head. "No, miss. The circumstances are too sad to be inspiring. I should like to read your other poetry." Miss Marianne clasped my hand more tightly than I could slip from. "Would you bring your little book to me? Tomorrow, perhaps?" A very odd request. I could not think what to say. She was giving an impression of being slightly unhinged. Perhaps it made more sense that she had killed Irma Eversham in a fit of madness, rather than part of a carefully devised plot. Seeing her so upset was most disconcerting. At last she let me follow Granny Jane to where we now must speak to Rose. On Friday evening, when Rose had rescued me partway, at least from entertainment embarrassment, had she then been dreaming of killing her mother? Was she so full of hurt and anger that she somehow conspired to end her mother's life as a way to rescue herself? Or had someone done this to her by removing her dearest, if prickliest, person? My eyes were spilling tears before I even spoke. I wished to express gratitude and condolence in one heartfelt sentence. Instead, I was struck mute. I wrapped my arms around her middle and let myself weep. For all the lost parents and left behind children, I had seen something that even Rose had not. Her dead mother. It was as though I'd spied her in the bath or heard her snoring, some intimate act that only family should ever know. "Shh." Rose patted me gently on the back. I gulped in the next swoop of tears and stood straight again. Granny Jane murmured her own words of sympathy and pulled me aside to dry my eyes with her handkerchief as others approached Rose. The room had become over-warm and stuffy, thanks to a crackling fire and the growing number of black-clad mourners. "I'm tempted to say Granny used the low voice she reserved for improper observations. Irma Eversham was never so popular alive as she apparently has become when dead as cinders. I covered my laughter with a cough and knew her to be correct. Years of eavesdropping had informed me that many of these townsfolk would have crossed the road rather than speak to Mrs. Eversham, or find themselves target of her spite. But was any of them, aside from Rose, genuinely distressed by her demise? Nothing like a murder, said Granny Jane, to gather a flock. Irma Eversham will be honored by more people as she enters her eternal slumber than she spoke to civilly in all of 1902. We edged our way to the dining room, where somber men and women gathered near a splendid array of refreshments. 2 plates of sandwiches, fish paste or sardine, tiered trays of champagne wafers, macaroons, and ladyfingers, an enormous platter of sliced lemon cake. Eyeing the riches with anticipation, I was overtaken by a memory from after Papa died. Along with new clothes, another small comfort of being in mourning was the quantity of cake delivered to our house from many kitchens about town. I particularly recalled buttered slices of a caraway seed loaf delivered by a distant neighbor. Only 2 days after losing Papa, I spent whole minutes devouring cake instead of pondering my bereavement. A lady wearing a hat with 4 black-dyed ostrich feathers had snagged Granny Jane in conversation. I sidled over to the refreshment table for a better look. I peeled off my gloves and stuffed them into the pocket of my coat before choosing a miniature cream puff sprinkled with powdered sugar. The plates and serviettes were at the end of the table, too far away to bother with. Oh, and Grace looked that up for us. Serviettes is like napkins in French, okay? Or not French, but just that's what serviettes is. I popped the whole confection into my mouth and took another. I'm not one to speak ill of the dead, said a hushed voice behind me, but it comes as no surprise that someone would want to remove Irma Eversham. On her best day, she was merely cranky. And that's being kind, whispered another voice. Goodness, who was saying such things? I dared not turn around to find out. The recently deceased seemed to have no friends at all. I stopped my tongue from licking the cream puff. The sugar dusted on top was very like the powder discovered by Hector on the paper in his new shoe. I tucked the pastry into a serviette and chose instead a pale yellow meringue. What a trial it must have been to live with her. Like a cat among the pigeons she was. I could scarcely abide her bossiness for the length of a ladies' committee meeting, let alone share a lavatory. That's a bathroom. There were several gasps of swallowed laughter. Hush, Myrtle, you naughty woman, said a third voice, though I do wonder how her daughter came to be so nice. Rose Eversham is not so nice as she pretends, said the first voice. Very saucy when she's with the boys, I've heard. Not at all pliant to her mother's will. Only a spitfire could stand up to Irma, someone commented. She'll have her own way now, without having to fight for it, won't she? Do you recall, said the one called Myrtle, early in Irma's marriage to the captain? He did something she nearly didn't forgive him for. Wouldn't speak to him for weeks, as I remember. A murmur. And she never did say what he'd done. A clucking of quiet guesses came in response to that. Had he drunk and told her that she was a homely sow? Oh, well, that would not be good, would it? No. He was never a drinking man. He caught her stealing guineas? Oh, guineas, money. From his he caught her stealing. Oh, I don't think this makes sense. So they're trying to figure out why she got mad at him and wouldn't speak to him. And the first guess was that he had had too much to drink one night and called her basically a big fat cow. Or that she was stealing money from his handkerchief drawer and he caught her. It seemed like it'd make more sense if it was the other way around, though, right? Oh, nonsense. He simply would not agree to having a cat. That does not make any sense whatsoever. I ate the meringue and considered another. This chatter was as good as play, and I had a front row seat, though I had yet to identify the players. Staying as still as a cream puff, I studied the lace of the tablecloth, my fingertip tracing the intricate curlicues of thread. And now she's dead, said Myrtle, taking her secrets with her. Her secrets, or somebody else's, said one of the others. Agatha? Granny Jane beckoned from near the shaded window. It was terribly dim in here. Why did the rules say that we must mourn in darkness? Shaded rooms, shuttered windows, drab clothing, black and purple dahlias and the wreaths. I remembered Papa best in the sunny garden, sitting in his chair with an iced lemon water at his elbow, devising sums and puzzles for me to solve. Next to Granny was a man whose very stiff collar appeared to push his chin uncomfortably upward. His nose was beaky, but his eyes crinkled when he smiled, as if truly happy to make my acquaintance. This is Fletcher's daughter, said Granny Jane, Agatha Morton. I furtively wiped the sugar from my fingertips as I dipped into a curtsy. Standing straight again, my eyes flew across the room instead of politely meeting those of Granny's gentlemen. I wished to see whether I might spot Myrtle and her gossiping friends. A row of plump, motherly women stood nibbling pastries and looking entirely innocent. Agatha, this is Mr. Hugo Steadfast. He is a solicitor and now lives in London. He and your father were chums back in their boyhoods. Solicitor is like a lawyer. Ancient history it will seem to you, Agatha, said Mr. Standfast. Your father was a couple of years older than I and knew all the ropes. Very able he was, getting us into and out of all sorts of scrapes. Dared me to go off the gentleman's diving platform my very first time. Must have been about 9 years old. Had this ever since. He pointed to a tiny scar above his left eyebrow, pale as a dove's feather. How odd to think that strangers had recollections of Papa entirely different from my own. This Mr. Standfast held memories of someone that I had never met. He knew the boy who'd plunged into the sea and spilled lemonade on his trousers at the town fete. The Papa of his memory was untarnished by weeks of illness or the wheeze of troubled laughter. Your father was my hero, said Mr. Standfast. I was most distressed to hear of his passing. I did not know what to say. His distress was mere hiccups compared with Mummy's or with Marjorie's and mine. And yet his sorrow should not be disregarded. Granny's lesson on bereavement had not addressed this courtesy, but she would expect me to respond with more than a mute nod. Are you friends of the Evershams also? I managed. Again, I have Fletcher to thank, said Mr. Standfast. He introduced me to the Evershams long ago. I was the captain's solicitor and also prepared his wife's will. He paused to glance over his shoulder. The smile he offered Granny was one that seemed tinged with apology. The will, he whispered, is now of great interest to the police in the pursuit of a motive. But I stand by my oath of privacy that it must first be read to the family, which will happen in a few days. Surely the family is curious as well, said Granny Jane, and I knew that she meant that she was curious. Is there any family? I said, apart from Rose? Miss Mary Ann was not related by blood. Would Rose not inherit everything? But how much was everything? Enough to kill for? Do you know what a will is? The lawyer said to me. Yes. I knew exactly what a will was, how it could alter lives. The document that Papa had written and left behind had initiated our financial woes, being nearly fully fiction. Papa had not, after all, been astute in his accounts, despite his role as my math tutor. His imaginary wealth was far greater than what he'd actually possessed, not enough to pay his debts, let alone keep his family secure. Luckily, it was Mummy who owned Groveland, or we should have lost our home. Luckily, too, Marjorie, that's her older sister, had married Rich, lovely James, who would help take care of us all. Granny Jane had a bit of money of her own and wouldn't be a pauper, Really, only Mummy and I were the ones to feel the pinch, and the servants we had to let go, poor things. We never ate steak as we used to, and that was my favorite. Now I wore dresses for 2 years instead of getting new ones each season. All sorts of corners to be cut. What if Captain Eversham and his wife had been similarly negligent? What if an impoverished fate awaited Rose? Perhaps she should not have been so generous in her donation to the refugee boxes. But if Rose had suddenly become a wealthy woman and had known beforehand that this would be so, Mr. Standfast may be in possession of information that could prove or disprove a reason for Rose to initiate a conspiracy. What does the will say? I was too eager to be shy. Do you know what lies ahead for Rose Eversham? Agatha! Granny Jane was sharp and firm. One never inquires about money. Mr. Standfast took a large bite of cake, leaving a smear of icing on his upper lip. My profession, he said, is rather like a detective or a spy. I, too, am concerned with other people's secrets. But the difference is that I do not pry. A lawyer waits for clients to come to him, and then listens to their confidential tales. But I certainly do not tell those tales myself. Hearing stories all day sounds like an ideal occupation, I said. Perhaps I shall become a solicitor. Mr. Standfast chuckled. A woman cannot be a solicitor, he said. I cannot think of a law school that would care to accept the female applicant. The bar exams are far too difficult. My eyes shifted to the doorway, where I could see Miss Mary Ann. Her hands being held by another well-meaning matron. She must never have heard Mr. Standfast's opinion of women, or he would not be welcome in her home. Remember, Miss Mary Ann was always for women's right to vote and things like that. Even if 1 or 2 members of the gentler sex were determined enough to succeed, what client would trust a woman with his secret? Not even a criminal would be so foolish. Females are known for being chatterboxes, which rather blights the oath of secrecy bit, you see? I did not feel quite so warmly toward Mr. Hugo Standfast as I had previously. I could keep an important secret, just see if I couldn't, and uncover plenty more. I took some comfort in how silly he looked with icing on his lip. Mr. Standfast, Granny Jane handed him a serviette. You must come up to Groveland for tea before you leave town, if you can bear to enter a household run by the gentler sex. Are you available on Tuesday? I know Fletcher's wife would be so pleased. Cora misses him dreadfully, and you will have reflections to share. He agreed at once. I wondered how pleased Mummy would truly be after having a stranger thrust upon her. It would require serving a proper tea instead of having a bowl of soup on a tray. But perhaps I would be allowed to invite Hector. Unless Charlotte managed to convince Mummy that his friendship was in some way harmful. Why did some people, like nursemaids and vicar's wives, imagine they knew what other people should be thinking about? This room was now as crowded as the parlor. Granny Jane and Mr. Standfast lowered their voices rather than raising them against the chatter. The bespectacled man, who had been at Friday's concert, stood by the refreshment table, devouring a tart with precise little bites, shedding flakes of buttery crust all down his chest. Why had a journalist come to a visitation? Was he paying his respects? Or pursuing the story of a murder? Mr. Fibley deserved closer scrutiny. I would say so to Hector when I had a chance. Miss Mary Ann and Rose had come in to join their guests. Rose sat on the bench of the pianoforte, looking bleary-eyed and weary. Mr. Roddy Fuswell stood close by, one hand resting on her shoulder. She did not look at him, nor he at her, though he kept patting her shoulder for all to see. If Rose's mother's ghost had recovered from the surprise of having such a populated visitation, she would strenuously object to a man who publicly caressed her daughter. He was just patting her on the back. I squinted up to the shadowed corners of the ceiling, imagining a phantom thin howl of, "Stay away from Rose." "Roddy is devoted to her," someone murmured. "Very attached." Attached like a bird to a silk stocking, I thought. Like dog hair to a velvet cushion, like wax candle on a lace cuff. Rose closed her eyes and swayed slightly, leaning against Roddy Fusswell. Wearing a silly grin, he stroked her hair, which made her sit straight up and bat away his hand. He promptly dismissed the woman talking to Rose and snapped his fingers at Nora the maid. I knew Nora. She came often to visit our maid Sally in the Groveland kitchen. She's told lots of naughty stories about Irma Eversham and had wished her evaporated many times over. How must she be feeling right now? Nora brought a small tray with a cup of tea already poured. She added milk, telling Mr. Fusswell that's how Rose preferred it, with just a splash. She's still in shock, he said. She'll have sugar too. He dumped in 2 teaspoonfuls, stirring briskly before handing the cup to Rose. My skin prickled as if suddenly there were ants crawling inside my camisole. Had I just witnessed a demonstration of how the murder had been performed? Cut from the Torquay voice. Poison! This is like a headline of a newspaper. Poison! Vicious murder in the Mermaid dance room. Woman's body discovered by children. Is there a killer on the loose? Torquay sways with fear. Full details in the evening edition. Augustus C. Fibley. So that's the journalist that was both in the Mermaid Route and has come to the visitation, and that is the end of chapter 10.